The new skill you've learned, Dr. Harrington.
Don't angioplasties easier.
Phones on airplane, please.
Hi, I'm Nancy Brown, Chief Executive Officer of the American Heart Association. Welcome to our broadcast to announce the recipient of the One Brave Idea Research Award. I'm really pleased to be joined today by our partners, Dr. Jessica Mega, Chief Medical Officer of Verily, Dr. Robert Harrington, Chairman of the Department of Medicine at Stanford University and member of the American Heart Association Board, and Greg Keenan, Head of U.S. Medical Affairs for AstraZeneca. Welcome to you all, and what an exciting day. You know, Jess, it's hard to believe that it was just about a year ago, right at this time, that the idea for One Brave Idea came about in a meeting with Andy Conrad, the CEO of Verily. Tell us about that day.
I remember that day incredibly well. And we were talking about how important scientific research is and really trying to think about innovative ways to fund this kind of research. And Andy said, let's get together and let's do something different. Let's bring together diverse organizations, let's commit significant capital, and find one visionary idea that truly is going to address coronary heart disease. And I think the opportunity not only to have the funding, but to have groups like the American Heart Association, like AstraZeneca, like Verily come together and say, how can we do this differently? And I would hope that this actually catalyzes new forms of funding, because research not only in coronary heart disease, but really all conditions deserves more attention.
Absolutely. And Bob, you were at that meeting.
I was.
Tell us your thoughts about it and how you feel this process has gone.
Well, to build upon what Jessica said, it was an exciting moment when Andy challenged all of us to think about what is the current paradigm of research and is it working? And so what did we do? We picked the world's most dominant form of death and disability, coronary heart disease, and we said, let's attack this, and let's attack it differently. And from my perspective, if we can lower the risk of coronary heart disease, if we could reverse it, if we could cure it, if we could prevent it, that's a huge public health statement and a huge public health progress going forward. Plus, along with Jessica, I loved the idea of getting more creative about how we think about the process of research. Is it going to be incremental or stepwise, or might we, by putting a single visionary leader, as has been said, with a multidisciplinary team, really think about attacking the problem differently? So I'm thrilled to be here today.
Thank you, Bob. And you know, Greg, it was shortly after the announcement that AstraZeneca joined on as our partner. Why was this so compelling for AstraZeneca?
Well, as you know, we at AstraZeneca have been working on heart disease for over 100 years, so this is an area that matters a lot to us, and it's important for patients, obviously. I think that Bob touched on it, the process, the compelling way to do this differently than typically research is done in incremental fashions is sort of the old way. This allows you to tear that plan up and do something really compelling and bring in different stakeholders, and it just is the kind of innovative things we want to be involved with. So that's why we're here.
Yeah, well, and we are delighted that you are. And you know, this idea really catalyzed a movement, I think, in healthcare among scientists and clinicians and in the technology community. When we announced One Brave Idea, there was great excitement. And then when we opened the application period in January and gave people only 4 weeks to answer 5 short questions, each question no more than 200-word answer, we were really flooded with great enthusiasm. And at the end of the day, on Valentine's Day 2016, 350 leaders had submitted their idea to One Brave Idea, representing teams from throughout the world. And boy, what a compelling group of ideas we received. And from that point, one of the beauties of One Brave Idea is how the joint leadership group came together. These leaders from AstraZeneca, from the American Heart Association, from Verily, who really will work in partnership with our leader. We worked so hard to make sure we reviewed every application, and then when we narrowed it down to the 26 semifinalists who gave us a bit more information, and then ultimately to the 10 finalists who came for their face-to-face interviews, it was very clear that One Brave Idea really sparked creativity, and it sparked a new way for people of thinking about approaching their problems. And that's exactly to the vision of what Andy Conrad was hoping that we would achieve. How could we allow people to dream and reach for the stars without having to have preliminary data to be able to give us their ideas? And I think that we have accomplished just that.
You know, Nancy, one thing that was interesting about the process, I remember a number of people who were finalists speaking to the refreshing way in which the process worked and how much they enjoyed presenting in the way that they did. It was just the whole process was refreshingly different and allowed them to really think differently.
And I think the fact that we even brought the 10 finalists together and had dinner with all of them with us was a really neat idea as well.
Yeah, I think that we've even heard that collaborations are forming inside and outside of this. And this is a time where research should be so important and really on the forefront of all of our minds. It was incredibly refreshing.
Absolutely.
And think about how quickly it went. It was only a year ago that we began to have those discussions and move this along so quickly. We announced it at scientific sessions last year at the American Heart Association meeting. And here we are less than a year later announcing the winner.
Absolutely. Well, with that, let's let the suspense be over. It is my honor and privilege on behalf of this joint leadership group to announce the recipient of the One Brave Idea Research Enterprise, Dr. Callum McCrae. Callum?
Congratulations.
Nancy,
Thank you.
Jess, good to see you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, Dr. McCrae, welcome and congratulations. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I'd first like to obviously thank everybody for tuning in and thank the Joint Leadership Group for giving us our team, this award. I originally trained in Edinburgh and in London in medicine and cardiology, and then I came and did some basic science training in Boston with John and Cricket Seidman in genetics, with Mark Fishman in developmental biology, great mentors. Another thing that I think is an important theme about this entire process. And then subsequently retrained in medicine and came back to the clinic and most recently have been the Chief of Cardiovascular Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston.
Terrific. And what inspired you to apply for the One Brave Idea Research Award?
I think it was the chance to do things differently. It was the chance to move lockstep and barrel into one completely new area where it looked like there was really unfathomed territory. Also the chance to think about building teams differently, building them in a more nimble and accessible fashion, engaging patients in a holistic way, and then obviously the chance to collaborate with the leadership group, with the HA, with Verily, with AstraZeneca, in different and convincing ways.
Terrific. And at a high level, tell us about your project and what you will accomplish with One Brave Idea.
So I think the fundamental thing that we recognized, I think it's an intrinsic part of the way medicine has evolved over the ages, is that we tend to go where we can find things. So we've tended to focus on the last 20 or 30 years of coronary heart disease because that's when it really presents. And what we decided would be an important way to move forward is to actually build on the insights that we've already developed in coronary disease, which have been substantial over the last 50 years, and move into a completely new area, move into earlier stages of life when the different forms of disease that end up looking like coronary heart disease all start, and really look for that very first step, that movement away from wellness, so that we can understand what's the mix of genes and development and environment that all comes together to lead to coronary disease 30 or 40 years later. And by distilling it into those very earliest steps, we believe we can understand the various influences much more clearly, move rapidly and efficiently towards prevention and new cures.
Terrific.
Yeah, really understanding this transition is so important. And it would be great to hear just a little more about your plan.
Yeah, so Jessica, that's something we've obviously known even in the field for a while, that autopsies after accidents or even in the relatives of people who have heart disease when they're teenagers, you can detect very subtle abnormalities. But we've never really done that in a systematic way because it required tools that were research-based and very invasive. But with changes in technologies, for example, we can now begin to measure those very same physiologic traits in everybody with wearables at the wrist. We can begin to bring in different environmental and nutritional factors that might be playing a part even as you're a teenager in your subsequent risk for coronary disease based on the GPS in your phone and known geospatial data data sets. There are a whole host of ways of bringing new cell biological tools back to the clinic. They've tended to exist in a separate research environment. Now moving those into the highest risk individuals, understanding what they tell us about the disease at those very earliest steps, and then translating that into broader populations. And that's our goal, is really to leverage all of the tools of modern technology, build on existing biological and biomedical science, engage patients and their families in much more holistic ways to try and build a comprehensive picture of what coronary disease really is at its very earliest stages.
Callum, as you point out, we often or historically have focused on high-risk patients, high-risk individuals. We've focused on later-stage disease. You want to look really early. There's going to be some challenges and obstacles with that. What are you thinking about in terms of what those might be and how you might approach them?
Yes, I think you make an excellent point, Bob. Signal noise is always an issue in research. It's particularly an issue when you get into very early stages in disease. I think there are two elements to that. One is we want to look where people haven't looked before. So the tendency has been in heart disease to look in the heart. We've known for decades that people with heart disease build up cholesterol under their skin. Why can't we measure that when they're 5 or 6 years old? Are there other cell biological abnormalities that we can get at? Are there ways of measuring the very earliest behavioral components that we can understand at a time when they haven't yet really marked them as irreversibly afflicted with coronary disease? But you're right, the key there is how do I work out what's signal from noise? And I think the innovations that have come to bear that allow us to do that are scalability. That one of the best ways of really starting to understand signal from noise is looking across very large populations, trying to understand what is it that truly is correlative, and then testing that going forward. And that's exactly the cycle that we've built in, is a very rapid innovation cycle, scale it to populations, and then validate, test, and move forward. And do that in a way that it's been done in lots of other industries, but has never really been done in healthcare.
So Callum, one of the things that was attractive to I think all of us is the ambition of your proposal, and yet it's incredibly complicated, the different elements you're going to be looking at. Working in industry, we know what it takes to get just one single clinical trial launched, carried through, enrolled, and complete the description of the study. How are you going to stay on track? How are you going to project management to actually get this thing done on time and on budget?
So that's also an excellent point, an area that we've focused on quite carefully. I think actually that's where the transformative way of putting teams together really comes into play. We have individuals who are not really in the traditional siloed biomedical science trajectory. So what that lets us do is identify the problems, put people on that problem with very rapid pilot cycles, not be afraid to fail early, move on to things that do work, and then validate those and move forward. So the things that we've actually built into the platform are to do that very quickly and early up front, to have a very rigorous validation steps in two traditional populations. First of all, the Framingham Heart Study, Million Veterans Program, but then to leverage the resources that the AHA and Verily bring to the table to also begin to scale much more broadly in the validation steps. In the background, we're also using big data science to try and understand, are there elements about what we know already about coronary disease that we can exploit to repurpose existing drugs or to use them differently? And you can definitely use drugs much differently if you can identify patients much earlier in the disease. So those sort of three streams will be coexisting as we go forward. But one of the key things is exactly that, is staying on target and having the ability to put resources where they're needed to answer, is this a question that we're going to make headway on, or is it not, quickly, and then move on to the things that do work very effectively and efficiently.
You mentioned the organizations behind this, and I think we were really excited not only to think about the financial support, but what it means to bring this group together. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts as you approached this particular award. How did you think about it?
Well, the way that I sort of, in my head, put it together was that each of these different entities and traditional biomedical research have sort of existed in parallel, and they will sort of interface in around very specific questions that are predefined in the silos. And the thing that's really, I think, one of the transformative elements of this award is the ability for us to actually bring it all together at the start, for us to really understand how Verily, the HA, AstraZeneca, the team members can all work together around this set of fundamental problems that, as Bob said, this is still the predominant cause of death and disability in the developed world. And indeed, in a significant proportion of individuals, the first presentation is sudden death. We have to be able to move the needle back, and I think the exciting thing is imagining how we can do that with partners that we haven't really even ever thought about working with before. I think it's an exciting possibility to do this differently and in, as I said, game-changing ways.
Callum, how do you see patients being involved in your research program? That was something that was very compelling to us at the American Heart Association.
Well, I'm still a practicing clinician, and I also actually work in inherited diseases. One of the things that I've always noticed when I'm talking to families is oftentimes they will know who's affected long before we can pick up the metrics of affection in the medical profession. And so taking a much broader, more holistic approach to understanding disease in partnership with patients, their families, and the community at large is, I think, a critical part of this. Understanding what are the behaviors that are markers of the pathways that eventually lead to coronary disease. What are the subtle physical findings that we never notice because they're not in the dogma from 150 years ago from medical practice. That's the type of thing that I think we can bring to the table and bring to it very effectively using social media, using patient engagement tools such as those pioneered by the AHA, and also thinking about ways that we can do it in partnership with Verily and AstraZeneca as well.
Callum, one of the things you talked about earlier that was exciting about this proposal for you was bringing together different viewpoints, people who are not traditionally thinking about biomedical science. One of the things that we all found very interesting was reading your proposal and the description of the team. You want to tell us about your team and some of the different types of expertise that we brought in?
Absolutely. It's a remarkable team. And as I said, one of the exciting things is the chance not only to work with the Joint Leadership Group, but to work in nimble and effective ways with the partners that we've put together in this team. So at the core is an existing relationship that I've had with Elazar Edelman and MIT in the prototyping of devices and moving them into the early phase in the clinic. We have a remarkable and long-standing partnership with you and Ashley at Stanford in genomics and also in thinking about how we use large biological data sets to inform disease. Working with Laszlo Barabashi, who's a social scientist at heart, a physicist by training, who's really interested in how the nutritional constituents of your food, how the people that you interact with relate to predicting outcomes, whether they be social outcomes or biological outcomes. A very creative biomedical scientist who's really a yeast biologist, Fritz Roth, who's very interested in how different genes interact with each other, something that we've never really been able to do very effectively in humans because the populations you need are so huge. And then, as I mentioned earlier, working with Vasan Ramachandran in the Framingham Heart Study, Chris O'Donnell, and Mike Gaziano in the Million Veterans Program, so large-scale projects, but also projects that have pushed the envelope in getting genomic and genetic data together. And then we also have had the chance to have Dave Grizel from Atlas Venture work with us. Really great experience in putting together transformative teams around problems that have proven very difficult to solve. Together, I think those plus all of the partners that we can then engage going forward, I think we can imagine a really creative and interactive team structure.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. You alluded to it, behavioral science and so forth. So a lot of the basis for coronary artery disease relates to the environment and how we engage there. And in your presentation, you alluded to this in some detail, some of the things that you might bring into the study with behavioral aspects of things.
Yes, so there are 2 or 3 elements to that I think stand out immediately. There are others, I'm sure, that we haven't even yet thought of. The most obvious ones are just simple exposures. So we're very focused on several exposures in medicine, on cholesterol, on blood pressure, on alcohol and tobacco. And those are all really important. But there's a whole universe, almost an infinity of environmental exposures that we don't really know about, some of which may or may not be important in coronary disease. And again, those risk factors that we have studied are to some extent related to the later stages of disease. If we could move back and in a holistic way start to understand what are the very earliest insults that combine with the genetics, combine with the developmental pathways to lead to coronary disease, that will be important. And you can do that nowadays just even by understanding where people live in a way that you couldn't 20 years ago. But there are also really creative ways of doing it with social networks, understanding what people are eating, understanding what people are drinking, and thinking about how that might relate. Second area is actually their behaviors themselves. As I said, I think earlier, we've focused on the way these pathways, which are very fundamental biological pathways, affect the arterial narrowing and the arterial physiology. Those same pathways are involved in many other cell processes, including in the brain, including in the skin, including in the liver. If we could understand how those may actually affect the behaviors that they then trigger the coronary disease that they're also at risk for, that might be an important piece of the puzzle. And so by studying behavior in that rigorous way in families that are afflicted with these types of disorders, we're going to be able to understand what behaviors may be associated with the pathways or what behaviors themselves trigger the activation of those pathways. So those are the sort of broad ways we thought about it at the start. I'm sure as we go forward and we bring in creative partners, we're going to be able to think of lots of new ways of doing this, and particularly thinking collaboratively with patients and their families.
Right.
I'm excited to do that.
You know, Callum, one thing that I've heard you talk about that is really exciting is thinking about how, because of this One Brave Idea Award and the research of you and your team, hopefully in the future, the entire way a doctor's visit or that encounter happens for patients could be different. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, so I think this is something that we've been thinking about quite a lot. One of the most interesting things about medicine is how much of the encounter is spent collecting information and how little is spent interpreting it.
Right.
And so by changing the very scale of data that we collect and making it data that the patient is engaged in collecting, whether it's symptoms data, whether it's exposures data, or whether it's their own biological phenotype, there's really the opportunity to make the clinic visit really just the icing on that cake. The data are already there, and what you begin to do in the clinic is actually push the systems. You understand the baseline. You can then begin to push the systems in different ways in a clinical setting. And I believe that that's ultimately how clinics will really end up operating. You'll only come to the hospital when you need to have your systems understood better and perturbed, and it'll be a much more of a collaborative enterprise than current clinical visits tend to be.
And much more rewarding
And
for
much
patients.
more rewarding for patients.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. Bob?
Callum, we're both in traditional universities, and one of the things that Andy really challenged us on is how is this research going to be non-traditional? Now, one of the things you're proposing to do is move outside the bit of the traditional structure within the university. Do you want to talk about that, how you're setting up your team? It's almost like a startup activity.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was something that the funding really, the structure of the funding, the scale of the funding allowed us to think about. We can begin to do things in a different way and not move away from the traditional structure, but build on it. And so that exact concept of a startup culture is something that I think we need in biomedical science. It's inherent in bringing the groups of people that I talked about earlier into the mix. We have to think about how all those pieces fit together, and they may fit together differently for one problem than they do for the next. So building an environment like that, I think, will be important. One of the things that we're planning to do is to have in our infrastructure ways of bringing in almost in an incubator-like setting to individuals from outside to work with the One Brave Idea team across the country and really think carefully about what are the things we need in order to solve the problems rather than how do we solve the problems that we can with the existing structures that we have. And I think that's something that the leadership group really has to be congratulated on, is bringing that concept to the fore. When I read the RFA, when I heard the original announcement at Sessions, that itself excited me to the point of really wanting to get involved in this and move it forward.
One thing that was really important to us was this idea of having one vision, so it wasn't so diffuse. Even if it was a visionary process, How do you see this diverse group of individuals, teams coming together, keeping them on track with one vision, and making sure that you really make a difference over time?
Yeah, that's also a challenge. That's something I have to take on. I have to take it on in my current role as well. But I think the exciting thing about it is that the process itself, as we talked about earlier, brought people together in different ways. We really came around this entire question as we were building the final proposal in a way that people realized that it's not going to be a traditional structure. We're not going to have lines of funding through 5 years. We're going to have problems that we solve. And so I think everybody really bought into that, and bought into it because I think they see it as a paradigm for changing the way that all of biomedical research is funded. This is really an amazing first step in rethinking the whole enterprise as a much more of a community-wide and much broader spectrum enterprise than it's traditionally been envisaged as sort of ivory tower type biomedical science.
You know, one of the things that perhaps the current way in which things are done traditionally, people fail slowly, and by that I mean it just takes years to sort of dismiss things. You've referenced, you know, let's fail fast. That's sort of a concept from a startup, and so how are you going to bring the startup mentality to folks that perhaps are used to a different paradigm?
Well, so it's actually quite interesting. When we explored this exact question with the team members, they were all excited at the chance to fail fast. I think sometimes the structure of the way we do things forces us to fail slowly. So as all of them will be willing to testify, and I certainly can, we're all used to failure. But I think finding the right way to fail and learning from that failure is something that we all want to do. And in fact, when we talked about it as a group, one of the things that came up was that by failing more openly and early, in an earlier way, in an earlier stage, you learn and you see whole new sets of projects around you. And I think that type of inference, which is again a critical part of startup culture, is the upside of that early failure downside. So I think it's a trade-off we're all willing to make and excited to try.
That's great.
So I think, as I said, I think the funding structure and the scope allows us to do that in creative ways.
You know, Callum, one thing we haven't talked about is the international impact of the work that you and your team will be doing. I know that anything that is developed or created that changes this patient encounter and allows us to identify that transition of disease earlier will impact people worldwide. But how will we test these concepts in international markets?
Well, I think there are lots of potential ways of doing it. I think we've highlighted a couple during the course of the last few minutes. I think, for example, exposures are very different in different countries. And so by collaborating with social networks in different areas, I think we'll be able to identify very quickly whether there's real signal with different exposures. The other thing that varies from population to population is genetics. But one of the most interesting things is, despite that, coronary disease remains a serious and endemic problem as societies develop. And so there are clearly real mixes of multiple genes and environment in that final common pathway. And as I said, by moving earlier, we may find very different early steps in different parts of the world than we do in the US, and that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for not just one or two of the earliest features in the traditional forms of the disease, but all of the early features in as many forms of the disease as we can get at.
Terrific. Jess, I'll give you the last question.
Well, one thing that we are so excited about is the potential here. If you were to predict where you would be, if I were to say where would things be 5 years from now, how would you answer that?
Well, I believe that we will have identified a significant new pathways in coronary disease. I believe we will be moving toward a cure for those pathways and preventative strategies that apply to those. And above all, I believe we'll have completely reinvented the way of doing science in this space. And I think that will be a major advance on its own.
And on that note, Callum, congratulations again on behalf of all of us. And to our viewers, please know that we will continue to keep you informed on the progress of Dr. McCrae and his amazing team through the One Brave Idea website, as well as through other mechanisms. We look forward to bringing your bold vision to life. And thank you and congratulations again, Callum.
Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Clear. Yay! Good job. Good
Thank
job.
you, guys.
Nice job. Yay.
Well done.
Thank you. Well done.
Awesome, Jeff.
Awesome. Awesome. Good, good, good.
Sorry.
Good.
Good job.
Yeah, well
Great,
done.
good. Yeah.
Good job there, Oprah.
Glasses.
Yeah, no, I know. Maybe